Hey y'all, so a little later in the day, the sun's pretty bright. All right, so now we're going to talk about a carbon tax as a kind of market-based regulation, and we're actually going to go through an example. So this is actually an example out of the text. I'm going to look at two different factories that emit CO2, and we'll see what happens when we impose a carbon tax. And let's say they have slightly different infrastructure that has different costs. Okay, so what I've got here is two different plants, right? Two different factories, right? Let's say they're producing energy. Let's just keep it simple. And just hypothetically, we're going to say that each of those plants is currently emitting 10 tons of CO2. So what we're going to see is that each of these, as we impose a carbon tax, they're going to be able to do some financial activity to decrease their CO2 output. And so for plant A, we're actually going to talk about the marginal costs per ton of CO2 reduced. So if they're emitting 10 tons of CO2, that's what they're doing today, so their marginal cost is zero. And then let's say for them to reduce 1 ton of CO2, so they'll only emit 9, that costs them $1. So $1 in cost to reduce CO2, and that makes our total cost $1. Super straightforward. And then what we can start to see, and we'll go through this, is actually the law of diminishing returns. So to reduce, so if we're emitting 10 tons of carbon, it's probably going to be fairly easy for us to reduce that first ton. We can go in and we can tune up some of the machinery. Cheap. But to reduce that second ton, we might have to replace one small part of a machine or do a little bit more work. And so that's actually going to cost us more. So that second ton is actually going to cost us $2 to get rid of. With the total cost, so to reduce, a reduction of 2 tons of CO2, now we're only emitting 8. We're paying $2 for that second ton, but our total cost is now 3, right? So it's 1 for the first one, 2 for the second one. And then let's go down to the next one. We're now going to have to pay more. We're really digging deep, so we're going to get rid of that third ton of CO2 is going to cost us $3. The total cost at this point is now $6. We get rid of that fourth ton of CO2. Things are getting pretty expensive here. It's going to cost us $4 to do. Now our total cost is actually 10. And so if we were to go after reducing that fifth ton of CO2, that's pretty significant. That's going to cost us $5. We probably had to replace a whole wing of the power generating apparatus. And so our total cost to do that is $15 once we get all the way down to get rid of 5 tons. So thinking about this model, one of the analogies I read is actually playing golf. I'm not sure how many of you all golf, but let's say you go out golfing and you shoot you're like me in the springtime. Maybe you shoot a 120, right? That's a terrible golf score. So there's low-hanging fruit. So you shoot a 120, you had a bunch of bad drives, lost a few balls, took all the penalties. But if you go and spend 1 hour at the driving range, you can probably get that score down to 110 or 115. So that first little bit is pretty easy. As you continue to push, you might have to get some golf lessons, right? So go spend some time with a pro and have them look at your swing. So that's an added cost to get your score down lower and lower. And eventually, it's non-linear, right? Like you can't keep going to the driving range and get your golf score down to a 65. You'd be a pro, right? There's actually this limit where however much work you're putting in or spending money kind of reducing your carbon output of your factory, it's not giving you the benefit. It's what we call diminished returns. So that's absolutely true in an industrial setting, right? It's fairly easy to get rid of the first ton. It's a little bit more difficult to do the second, more and more and more. and then the total costs, again, to take our carbon emissions from 0 down to, or to take our carbon emissions from 10 tons down to 5 tons, it's going to cost us $15. Obviously, we could add a whole bunch of zeros here. So that's great, but let's think about what happens if we install carbon tax. So now let's say, so we, our elected political leaders decide, you know what, we're going to put a $4 tax on each ton of carbon. Okay, well, so here, Plant A is currently emitting 10 tons of carbon, and so they're going to pay a $4 tax for each of those 10 tons. And obviously, the first thing that the accountants are going to do is get out some pencils and some paper, Excel spreadsheets, and figure out where's the sweet spot, right? So if they spend $1 to get rid of that first ton of CO2, they saved $4, right? So our $4 cost to emit that 10th ton, we paid $1, and now we're emitting 9 tons, right? So we reduced our tax burden by $4. Great, money in the bank. So now, when we go to reduce our second ton of CO2, again, we're going to save $4 by doing that, and that's going to cost us $2 to get rid of that second ton. So now we've saved $8 in taxing, right? So our tax bill has gone down. And now if we look at our third ton of CO2, well, it's going to save us $4, and it's going to cost us $3 to get our value out of it. So we'll just go ahead and do that, right? So we'll pay the $3 in investment to save our $4 in tax to go down to, reducing 4 tons of CO2. So the first three are pretty simple, right? So the cost was less than the tax. So the decision was really easy to make. It gets interesting when we get down to getting rid of that 4th ton. So to get rid of this 4th ton and save the $4 that goes along with it, it's actually going to cost us $4 to do. And let's say these people at the factory are great. They like the environment, and they're like, you know what, that's a break even. Let's go ahead and do it. And so, great. Now they can start putting their focus on getting rid of that 5th ton of carbon. And when they look at it, it's going to cost them $5 to do that because of diminishing returns. Like now, it's getting really expensive to make the factory more efficient. And they could spend $5 to kind of end up with saving $4. That economy doesn't work out. So in this case, a $4 carbon tax reduced us down to, with a reduction of 4 tons of CO2. So that reduced us down to 4 tons so we reduced our emissions by 4 tons of CO2. We're currently emitting 6 tons of CO2, and essentially we're breaking even with the carbon tax. So this organization ultimately had to spend $10. So ultimately they spent $10 to get rid of 4 tons of CO2. That's pretty good. And so you can see that when you do a carbon tax, it doesn't apply this like blanket goal like we talked about with the previous kind of conventional regulations. Here, those that can get rid of the carbon easily or can increase efficiency really easy are incentivized to do it as much as possible until you get to the point where you can no longer make financial sense of it, right? Until until you've reduced your emissions so much that the costs outstrip the benefit. So here, we spent $10 and we reduced our emissions from 4 tons, and now we're sitting pretty. But let's actually think about Plant B. So Plant B, let's say Plant B is a little bit older. The machines are all made in, a country that no longer exists by a company who no longer exists. It was really hard to find people to work on them. Maybe they've got some other problems. So for them, let's say the marginal cost is actually just double this. So for them to get rid of their first ton, they're pretty dirty, right? So for them to get rid of their first ton, it's going to cost $2. So with a total of two, let's say their second ton is going to cost $4 for a total of four. And then their third ton will cost $6 for a total of 10. We could go even further here just to fill out the table. Let's say this costs $8. That makes this 18. What are we at here now? $10, and that's now 28. So things ramp up pretty quickly. But if we look at plant B, they actually have a similar situation, right? They have similar accounts. They all probably went to school together. And so let's see what happens in this case for plant B with a $4 carbon tax. So if they reduce 0, they're emitting 10, everything stays the same. They go to do their first reduction, right? Because remember, that'll save them $4. So they tune up their gear, they're reducing 1, emitting 9. We're over here. They're actually spending 2 to do that. So they're good. But now when they go to get rid of their second ton, they're now emitting 8. We got the same problem that we saw before. So it's actually going to cost them $4 to get down to a reduction of 2 tons to only emit 8. But let's say again, they're good folks, and they say, all right, yeah, we see this. We'll go ahead and do that. So they're paying $4 to reduce 2 tons of CO2. But when they look at modifying their equipment or getting some new equipment to reduce that third ton of CO2, they're going to save $4 by doing that, but it's going to cost them 6. So actually, plant B, they've got a different deal. So with the carbon tax, the way that their system fits is they actually paid $4 for a reduction of 2 tons. So their situation was a little bit different. But let's go and kind of think about how that all worked out. So what we can see here is clearly Plant A, it was easier for them to make these modifications. They did more. Plant B did a little bit, right, until the math checked out. So collectively, Plant A and Plant B together, we spent $14 for 6 tons of CO2 reduction. So that's a really good example of how a carbon tax works. Let's actually compare that carbon tax to conventional regulation. So in conventional regulation, it looks like we got a total of 6 tons done here. And let's say, to compare this, the government says, okay, we're going to cap your carbon emissions at 7 tons. Whoever you are, I don't really care. 7 tons is as much as you can emit. So we'll achieve the same amount of carbon reduction, but we'll do it with a conventional regulation. So here, if they are emitting 7, so here, Plant A, if they're emitting 7, right, so they're doing a reduction of 3, they're going to spend $6. So they had to spend $6 for that 3 ton reduction, which is actually a bargain, right? They were spending $10 in the previous example, but it was easy for them to do this. But now when we look at Plant B, if we ask them to do the same thing, so reduce 3, only emit 7, because that's our new conventional regulation limit, it's actually going to cost them $10 to do it. And if we look at how that impacts the big picture, in this case, voila, right? So now I'm really feeling like an economist. So if we look at the carbon tax and we let those that can more easily kind of clean up their act in a sense, they can do it more cheaply. Other places that can't, this system is financially less efficient than this system. So that's actually the beauty of a carbon tax, is that it really is flexible, right? So if you can take advantage of it, you can really take advantage of it. If you can't take advantage of it so much, you still can a little bit. And so this actually focuses reduction on the low-hanging fruit. Carbon tax adds a lot of flexibility into the system. So hopefully this made sense to you. Just to reiterate, doing a $4 carbon tax, collectively, these companies spent $14 to reduce 6 tons, and doing a conventional regulation with a carbon cap of 7 tons, collectively, these industries actually paid $16. And if it's power that's all going into the national grid, this power is going to cost more. So you can see again, conventional regulation isn't dynamic enough to really want to be adopted by everyone. So we're going to loop back in the next video and talk about cap and trade, or kind of emission trading schemes, ETS. It's similar, but we'll again give it a similar treatment.